Good morning. I'm Doug Dibbert. I'm president of the University of North Carolina General Alumni Association, and it's my delight to welcome you to our first ever virtual Old Students Club luncheon. Now, repeat offenders, that means repeat attenders of our Old Students Club luncheon, know that a typical Old Student Club's luncheon occurs on the Friday before commencement. It's in the Alumni Hall. And if you're a younger member of the Old Students Club, the chances are that you're downstairs virtually watching or the streaming because you're so young that you're downstairs in the Dowd Harris room or the People's room. So that's the only way to accommodate this continuing only free lunch in Chapel Hill. It dates back to the early 40s when the late James Lee Love decided that he wanted to provide an endowment for the Old Students Club luncheon, and our obligation is to continue to invite all those who are away from Carolina, have graduated or attended and finished 50 years ago or earlier. Normally, we would be inducting a class into the Old Students Club, but the class of 71 is not likely to be here in great numbers, but they look forward to joining all the others next May, when we'll probably have a standing room only opportunity for the Old Students Club luncheon. Now, some of you, when you heard that Bill Ferris was going to be our Old Students Club speaker, said, no, wait, is that the same Bill Ferris that spoke to the Old Students Club a few years ago? The answer is yes, but he's got a new book. And if you're interested in the new book, the autographed new book, you can go into the chat and you can get all the information you would need. And we don't want you to miss that opportunity. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce William Ferris. He's the Joel R. Williamson Eminent Professor of History, Emeritus at the University of North Carolina. And he is the former chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities. He's written or edited 10 books and created 15 documentary films. He's co-edited the Encyclopedia of Southern Culture, which was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. In 2019, his Voices of Mississippi received 2 Grammy Awards for Best Liner Notes and for Best Historical Album. His honors include the Charles Frankel Prize in the Humanities, the American Library Association's Dartmouth Medal, the Mississippi Institute of Arts and Letters Award, and the W.C. Handy Blues Award. Rolling Stone magazine named him among the top 10 professors in the United States. He's a fellow of the American Folklore Society. He received the B.L.C. Wales Award given to the Mississippian who has achieved national recognition in the field of history by the Mississippi Historical Society. And in 2017, he received the Mississippi Governor's Arts Award for Lifetime Achievement. Finally, and from the GA's perspective, most importantly, in 2021, this year, he received the association's Faculty Service Award. Please give a warm Carolina muted welcome to Professor William Ferris. Bill?
Thank you, Doug. It's an honor to be here today. And I want to say a special word of thanks to you, Doug, and to Jennifer Guy for setting up the technology and for honoring me with this wonderful platform to visit with your alumni. I want to tell you briefly about my background prior to coming to Carolina. I grew up on a farm in Mississippi near my grandfather, who often reflected that he had been, quote, raised on cornbread and recollections. I've spent my life trying to understand those recollections and how they shape the place we call, in quotes, the South. Whether our families have lived here for centuries or arrived last week, we are all curious about the South and how it defines our memory and sense of place. The writer William Faulkner wrestled with this question all his life, as he said, trying to understand his little postage stamp of native soil. In one of his novels, he has a Mississippi student, Quentin Compson, in his dorm room at Harvard. He's just arrived and met his roommate, Shreve, from Canada. Shreve is curious about the South, and he asks Quentin, tell about the South. What's it like there? What do they do there? Why do they live there? Why do they live at all? These are the questions we will always wrestle with in trying to peel the onion of knowledge about the South. And we're never too old or too young to study the South, a topic that Carolina has pioneered in shaping and defining the field that we call Southern Studies. Wilson Library houses the world's largest archive on the region. And today, Carolina students can do their MA, their BA, and their PhD degree in Southern Studies. I'm going to shift and share the screen with everyone to talk about a specific interest of mine, photography. And in my most recent book, Photography and Freedom, the enduring legacy of civil rights photographs in the American South in the decade from 1960 to 1970. Now, my relationship with Carolina is long and deep. Long before my wife Marcy and I moved here to teach and work at Carolina, I published a book I co-authored with Charles Wilson called The Encyclopedia of Southern Culture that was published by the UNC Press. I'm proud to say it's their #2 best-selling book. The #1, of course, is Mama Dip's cookbook. And the most recent of my books that they published is called The South in Color. It's about my color photography and the importance of photographs in exploring this topic of how they embody memory and sense of place. And I can say to each of you watching this program that were I to walk into your living room and visit your home, I know without asking that there are photographs on the wall and on the tables of your family, of ancestors, of places that are special to you, that keep those worlds alive and well. Before that, I published The Storied South, a collection of my interviews with Southern writers and artists, including Eudora Welty. And my first book, the first of the trilogy on the South that I've done with the UNC Press, was on the blues and sacred music with B.B. King on the cover. The title of that book I took from a blues song called Highway 61 with the lyric, I walked Highway 61 till I give down in my knees, trying to find somebody to give my poor heart ease. And as Doug mentioned, 2 years ago, I published a box set of my recordings. It's something that looks a little like a cigar box, and inside there are 3 CDs of blues, gospel, and storytelling, and a DVD of my documentary films, and a book that received 2 Grammy Awards to my surprise and delight. But what we're looking at and sharing today is my most recent book that accompanies an exhibition of photography on the civil rights movement in the decade of the 60s. And I should say with pride that over half of these photographs were located in Wilson Library and the collections there. The exhibit was commissioned in the Montpellier, France Photography Museum, the Pavillon Populaire. And the catalog is introduced by Lonnie Bunch, who was the founding director of the National African American Museum, and today is the first Black secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. Lonnie spoke at Carolina a few years ago. He has deep family roots in this state, and many of his family have studied at UNC. The project moved from France and opened earlier this year at the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum in Jackson. And the English translation of the book was just published. And next year it will travel for 6 years around the nation to museums. So that this topic of photography and civil rights is close to my heart. And I would suggest that photography, like the fabled music and stories of the American South, bears witness to the region's past, to her people, and to the places that shaped their lives. The photographs featured in I Am a Man are vessels of truth, truth about the courage of protesters who faced unimaginable violence and brutality. These photographs capture the quiet determination of elders and the angry commitment of the young. The protesters in these photographs became a wedge in the segregated South. The years from 1960 to 1970 were a historic decade that unleashed both hope for the future and profound change as public spaces were desegregated and Blacks secured the vote. The decade was a pivotal moment that both marks change yet also reminds us of how far we have to go. These photographs are a significant backdrop for the Black Lives Matter movement in America today. Photographs of protesters who carried signs with messages like, I am a man, or sat at segregated lunch counters are iconic, familiar images associated with the civil rights movement. Civil rights organizations recognize the power of photography to publicize their cause and to secure support for their movement. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, hired photographer Danny Lyon to document their struggle. Lyon's photographs dramatically illustrated the movement's ideology, as seen in his images on posters that state, "Come, let us build a new world together," and "One man, one vote." Lyon recalled that his arrival in Jackson, Mississippi reminded him of traveling to South Africa. Quote, "When the DC-8 landed in Jackson, I might as well have been stepping off in Johannesburg. Everything frightened me." And those photographs from Jackson and the worlds that he entered are truly iconic images. Just as black and white protesters joined arms to march and sit in, the photographers were also black and white. Photographers covered communities like Chapel Hill, Memphis, and Jackson for local newspapers that featured their work. And this exhibit and book proudly acknowledges their bravery and their artistry. Jim Wallace was a student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill when he photographed demonstrations for the student newspaper, the Daily Tar Heel. He remembered that, quote, "I needed to get there just after they started a sit-in, and before they were arrested, they needed me to be there to take photographs. My presence helped keep things cool. It took several police officers to carry them out of where they were sitting in. The entire time they were always singing freedom songs." These photographs of the American Civil Rights Movement are visual monuments that stand the test of time. They are a powerful reminder that lessons learned in one period, the decade of 1960 to 1970, help us address the global struggle for justice today. Look at the faces and their expressions as they register to vote, as they desegregate a lunch counter, as they march. The viewer feels their conviction, their courage, and their dignity. Frederick Douglass recognized the importance of photographs for Black people who sought freedom and full citizenship as Americans in the 19th century. The most photographed American of his era, Douglass understood that Black lives were honored and preserved through photographs. The first photograph of Douglass was a daguerreotype, and he sat for 160 photographs during his lifetime. In his lecture on, quote, pictures, Douglass argued that the great discoverer of modern times, to whom coming generations will award special homage, will be Daguerre. What was once the special and exclusive luxury of the rich and great is now the privilege of all. The humblest servant girl may now possess a picture of herself, such as the wealth of kings could not purchase 50 years ago. Douglass believed that the daguerreotype dignified former slaves as human beings. Randall Keenan, formerly on our faculty and one of our great writers who sadly died this past year, makes extensive use of photography in his book, Let the Dead Bury the Dead. In Keenan's short story, This Far, a photograph of Booker T. Washington inspires a thoughtful reflection on Washington and his relation to Black liberation. Keenan writes that the photograph, quote, taken by Francis Benjamin Johnson in 1906, those light eyes, the arched eyebrow, the full nose, the prominent elfin ears, the Indian lips, the word handsome is impeached by dignity. Look at the dark flesh under the eyes. Here's a man who spent many a sleepless night poring over documents and papers to make men free. That, for Booker T. Washington, is a photograph that inspired Keenan's work as a writer of fiction. Art Shea photographed the first Black student to enter the University of Mississippi, James Meredith, and the 3,000 troops sent by President John Kennedy to protect him. Shea courageously followed the movement and recalls how, cameras at the ready, I found myself covering a homegrown war in which, to my horror, I saw the enemy as people like me, who thought the whiteness of their skin gave them a better birthright to America than the dark people had. It became the job of photojournalists like me to report what was happening as we watched. Within the history of photography, images taken in the 60s, like Shea's at the University of Mississippi, mark a special body of work. Photographs captured violent, dangerous confrontations between local whites and civil rights workers who risked their lives to engage in nonviolent civil disobedience. Inspired by the voice of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., thousands of courageous people risked their lives to end Jim Crow segregation within the American South. As a student during the decade of 1960 to 70, I deeply identified with the civil rights movement and the photographs that brought these events into the homes of Americans. My own work as a folklorist who documented Black and white worlds in the South was shaped and inspired by these photographs and their deep authenticity. Who would not be touched by the sight of people attacked by whites simply because they wish to vote, to eat, to study in a public facility? These photographs were a catalyst that moved history forward. They challenged racism at the grassroots level. It is said that when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1862, he remarked, quote, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." Just as Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin stirred outrage against slavery, these photographs inspired support for the civil rights movement around the world. Images of neatly dressed demonstrators tear-gassed and beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, were photographed by Spider Martin. The image of an effigy of James Meredith hung from a rope at the University of Mississippi, taken by Art Shea, and that of the body of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. as it lay in state in Memphis were also captured by Art Shea and galvanized opposition to segregation in the American South. Ernest Withers' photographs of demonstrators holding "I am a man" signs affirm that Black lives matter truly do matter. These images reveal the humanity of Black men, women, and children who voted, marched, and sang freedom songs to affirm their full citizenship as Americans 6 decades ago. While photographing the funeral of Medgar Evers in Jackson, Mississippi in 1963, Ernest Withers recalled, "I was standing on the sidewalk taking one horrible scene after the other. Amid the screams, suddenly a burly white man came over and snatched me into the street. The force of the movement took the top off my camera. As I tried to retrieve it, a policeman came over and began beating me with a nightstick and ushering me toward the truck." Music was a powerful force for organizing demonstrators with freedom songs, such as those sung by Bernice Johnson Reagan, who also spoke at UNC several years ago, and the SNCC Freedom Singers, legendary singers like Sam Cooke, the Staples Singers, and Bob Dylan all sang at civil rights events. And this photograph, of course, is of the Duke Ellington, signing programs from his concert. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. had a deep love for Mahalia Jackson's gospel music, and she inspired his "I Have a Dream" speech at the Lincoln Memorial when she told him, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." The anthem of the civil rights movement, "We Shall Overcome," was adapted from a traditional Black spiritual by Pete Seeger. Seeger explained how he changed the will to shall. "I think it opens up the mouth better," he said, and within 1 month it spread throughout the South. So music was a key part of the movement as captured in these photographs. Photographers who grew up in the South were well aware of the danger they faced when they approached demonstrators and police. Florida native Charles Moore recalled how, quote, "As a born and bred Southerner, I was often shocked at the behavior of some places and people in worlds like Selma, Birmingham, Oxford, and St. Augustine. Their faces, contorted in anger, threatened me and cursed at me. I was not the instigator of violence. I was there to record news events that were making history. For all journalists covering the civil rights story through the 60s, it was difficult, exhausting, and often very dangerous. For me, it was all the above, plus troubling and emotional in a personal way, because I am a Southerner too." Spider Martin, a native of Fairfield, Alabama, was familiar with the racial views of whites in his state. As he photographed near the Brown Chapel AME Church in Selma, Alabama, he recalled, quote, "These Alabama state troopers are looking at me. I thought they were going to shoot me. They had been told by Governor Wallace that Spider Martin has had too many pictures in the Yankee press. Get him." A lady grabbed me by the arm and pulled me inside her apartment. She said, "You get yourself in here before they kill you." All of a sudden, I was inside and smelled soul food. She said, "Sit down and eat." I had turnip greens, black-eyed peas, pork chops, cornbread, and iced tea. I wolfed it down and started to leave, but she said I should eat the banana pudding. I said I had to go, but looked out and saw that Dallas County posse deputy with that big gun, I ate the banana pudding. After Martin photographed a civil rights worker wearing a jacket with, quote, Alabama goddamn written on its back, he asked the marcher, quote, what Alabama goddamn meant. He said it meant, Lord, these people have enslaved my people for 400 years. Damn them. So Spider Martin was definitely unwelcome in George Wallace's world. Because Black Americans have associated photography with freedom for over 150 years, the images in this exhibit have special power. And just as the photograph of, quote, whipped Peter Gordon, a former enslaved laborer whose back was scarred by a whipping he received in 1863 on the Lyons plantation in Louisiana, is seared into our memory, just as the 1955 photograph of Emmett Till's mangled face that his mother, Mamie Till, be displayed in an open casket to, quote, let the world see what they did to my boy. These images bear witness to the unfathomable violence courageous protesters faced in the 60s. The 1955 photograph of Emmett Till inspired the civil rights movement that followed in the decade of 1960 to 70. When the photographs in this exhibit were taken, these photographs document the sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960, the Freedom Riders in 1961, the voter registration drives, and the admission of James Meredith as the first student to enter the University of Mississippi, the Freedom Summer of 1964, and the murder of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. To paraphrase Mamie Till, these photographs remind us of what they've done to our people, Black, white, old, young, Protestant, Catholic, and Jew, all of whom marched for freedom. 30% of the Freedom Riders were Jewish, many of whom were children of Holocaust survivors. Two of those Jewish students, Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, and their fellow civil rights worker, James Chaney, were murdered near Philadelphia, Mississippi during Freedom Summer in 1964. Their photographs are forever etched in our memory as they appeared on an FBI missing persons poster in 1964. The Ku Klux Klan used terrorist violence to intimidate civil rights workers and Black families. Memorable examples of such violence include the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham, Alabama on September 15th, 1965, when 15 sticks of dynamite planted by 4 members of the Klan exploded and killed 4 young girls and injured 22 others. Reverend Martin Luther King described the event as, quote, one of the most vicious and tragic crimes ever perpetrated against humanity. The decade of 1960 to 70 was a momentous time for the civil rights movement in the American South and the nation. The photographs in I Am a Man are a reminder that future generations must continue the fight for justice and for all humankind. And that fight, in many ways, depends on institutions like the University of North Carolina, who have preserved the record of the history of the American South, which in so many ways offers keys to the future for both our nation and the world. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bill, for that sterling address, those very timely remarks coming only 3 days after the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, and just a few days in advance of next Monday being the 100th anniversary of the massacre at Tulsa. This is now an opportunity for those of you who've been viewing to enter your questions for Professor Ferris in the Q&A. Let me emphasize the Q&A is awaiting your questions. While we're waiting, I would be interested in Bill in telling us a little bit more about how long you had been contemplating this book and why it waited until this moment in your rather distinguished career.
Well, this, unlike all the other books I've done, was not my idea. It came from a friend, an old friend named Gilles Morat, who is the leading authority on photography in France and has written books on American photographers like Walker Percy, Walker Evans, and is about to do a book on Eudora Welty's photography. And he called one summer, and out of the blue, he said, I want to do an exhibit of photographs on the civil rights movement in the decade of the 60s. Would you curate it for me? And I naively agreed, and it has taken over my life for the last 6 years and continues. But neither he nor I knew how timely the exhibit would be. It was simply noting a 50-year marker of that decade and the death of Dr. King. But while we were doing this, and since, the whole Black Lives Matter has swept the nation, and these photographs have taken on increased power. And so I've sort of let it carry me with it, but it was not my idea. And the whole thing grew out of an initiative in France that is now moving around the nation. And it's really sort of has a power of its own.
It's interesting. In the summer of 1968, I was with a number of other college students who had come together for something sponsored by the National YMCA, and we were housed at George Washington University, just a short distance away from where Resurrection City was. I'd be curious as to whether you happened upon any photography capturing that particular moment in time.
We did. These are just a handful of photographs. We had thousands that we chose from to put the exhibit and the book together. But Roland Freeman, who is a Black photographer based in Washington, has many photographs of Resurrection City, and his photographs are also included in this exhibit. The mule train from Marks, Mississippi to Washington, D.C. was part of Resurrection City. And he photographed that whole mule train experience and the tents of Resurrection City. That was a very important part of that whole decade.
Were there important events that you went in search of photography and were surprised and disappointed that somehow those moments were not captured?
Well, this whole thing was sort of an awakening for me. and I learned from my students and colleagues. I initially thought I would be driving around the South and other places looking at photographs and selecting images. But my students quickly told me, no, these are all online. And so most of our work was done remotely. And we were flooded with photographs. The only restrictions were financial. Some of the photographs were very expensive to license, and we had to be careful in those areas. But one of the guidelines that we were given is that the exhibit should not only have the famous like Danny Lyon, but photographers who were largely unknown, who would photograph a local event for the newspaper. And we turned up many photographs that had never been seen before that were quite powerful, of Klan rallies that were in archives. We found some archives of police records. There's a powerful record of Martin Luther King being booked by a sheriff's department, and it has the photograph of him as he was being booked into the cell. Intimate, disturbing, and in many cases, beautiful photographs of elderly women. One who is 100 years old, registering to vote in Greenville, Mississippi, taken by a photographer who is identified as being from Greenville, South Carolina. And we tracked it back to Greenville, Mississippi. He was a minister who worked with voter registration. And I asked my friend Hotting Carter, who lives here and is retired from UNC. He remembered him vividly from the 60s. And that photograph is especially powerful because he photographed this elderly Black lady, 100 years old, registering to vote for the first time. So those were the pearls that we found, in addition to the well-known ones like Ernest Withers' "I Am a Man" photographs, which are iconic.
One of the questions in the Q&A is, how do you or can you compare the images we see in the media today of the Black Lives Matter with the images from the period covered by your book?
That's a great question. I think what this whole experience has shown me is that photography, and more recently film and iPhones, are a kind of powerful vehicle for social change. And we can see this in the photographs of Emmett Till, in the photograph of the slave with his scarred back, but we can also see it in George Floyd with this young woman who happened to be there and happened to have her phone and filmed the tragic murder of this man, which is now a global experience. So the visual images have morphed in terms of how they're taken and shared. But I think you can see a very close connection between the images in Black Lives Matter, many of which are filmed, because as I tell my students, you have no excuse not to document your parents and grandparents and to do the kind of work that I did as a young folklorist, which was expensive and hard to do, but you have in your pocket a camera that will record, photograph, and film high quality images, and it's free. You simply turn it on. So that's, to me, we are living in a whole new dimension of how we document life. And virtually every person on the planet is now able to do that if they simply have a camera and a phone with all that comes with it.
Bill, we have another question. Who collected or donated the photographs to the Wilson Library?
Well, the Wilson Library, I call it the Vatican of Southern Studies. And it has within it a massive Southern historical collection of manuscripts, the Southern folklife collection of recordings, and a photography collection. And that we're talking about thousands of collections, some of which have a few photographs, maybe a family album. Others are thousands of photographs, in some cases, maybe 1 million of archives from newspapers. And collection by collection, if there is a civil rights topic, as these librarians process it, and I love to remind people that this is the first public university and the oldest library school in the nation, and the finest, both public university and library school. So these collections are processed in an incredibly thorough way and then shared online globally. So many collections are there that are only photographs, and we worked through those, but we also found larger collections that included photography. So it was a winnowing process, and we had a tremendously gifted team of students and colleagues from Duke and UNC, and including a high school student from Jackson, Mississippi, an aspiring photographer who is now an honors student here at Carolina. And so we had many students and faculty and colleagues who worked with us, as well as our colleagues in France. And that work is going on as this has moved to this country and is now circulating. And I want to remind our listeners, if you have archives, family papers, photographs, this is where they should be placed for the legacy of your family. All of my family's papers, my own, are there. And to me, it's the most important part of a truly great university. If you want to measure a university or a home, you look at the library. And this library is second to none when we talk about the American South.
It's clearly a treasure that all of us are continuing to benefit and learn more about. We have a question from Johnston County. I have to ask if you have photographs of the infamous KKK billboard sign at the city limits of Smithfield and the subsequent history to its eventual demise.
I think there are photographs of that. And one of the people who worked on this project was my former student who grew up there and remembered that sign. And so it was a topic of discussion as we were going through all of this. Mary D. Williams, she is a folklore MA from Carolina, a gifted gospel singer. And as a child, her grandmother would take her to Smithfield to shop. And she told me about that sign. And Mary traveled with us as part of our team to the opening of the exhibit in France. And she performed civil rights songs and gospel and brought the house down. But that sign is certainly something that I think we have photographs of that and probably other documents as well here.
Another question, did you hire any Black students or scholars to assist you with this project? It is very
Yes,
traumatic for Black people to continue to be left out of these types of educational projects about our history, and at the same time watch the majority population receive all the accolades.
that's a great question. Mary Williams is Black. Elijah Haywood was another of my graduate students who is Black, who finished his PhD in American Studies and is now the chief operating officer of the new Slave Museum in Charleston. We had a number of Black students who worked with us on the project, but those are two that I remember with special pleasure. And the team who traveled with us, who spoke from UNC in Montpelier, included William Sturkey, a Black historian, Jenna Ray McNeil, a Black historian who just died, all UNC faculty, and Lanice Williams in our art history department, and Louise Toppin, who was former chair of music here and is now at University of Michigan. So we had, and James Meredith also was featured on the program prominently, and Doris Derby, a Black female photographer, featured, also traveled, and Roz Withers, the daughter of Ernest Withers, was featured. So in every way possible, we have tried to respond, as the question suggests, to the times in which we live.
I think we have time for a couple more. One question is, do any of the photographs illustrate the fight for freedom by Lumbees or other Native Americans?
I don't know if there are Lumbee photographs in here. That's a good question. We simply used what we could find, and I'm sure the photographs are there, but if we were to look for those, but we did not find any and they were not included.
I think this may be our final question. So many of these photographs are chilling and impactful. Is there one photograph that you think is the most impactful to this mission of enlightenment?
Well, that's like asking a parent, which of your children do you love most? I think it's the photograph I'm looking at the moment that is whichever. But the I Am a Man photograph was sort of picked because it did embody iconically the fact that Black Lives Matter is about people being treated as human beings and deserving of equal rights. And for so long, Black men were called boys. I mean, that's the history implied in that photograph seemed to speak for the exhibit. But every one of those photographs that we chose and many others are moving beyond words.
Well, Professor Ferris and my friend Bill, thank you so much for taking time to share these wonderful photographs, your book, the history. You reference what a joy and a gem and a treasure the Wilson Library and the Southern Historical Collection is, but that also is greatly aided by the work that you've been doing for so many years, and what an inspiration you have been for all of us. And on the afternoon leading into Memorial Day weekend, we wish you and Marcy the best, and we thank you again, and we thank all of our viewers, and we look forward to seeing you next year at the Old Students Club lunch in the George Watts Hill Alumni Center. Thank you to my colleagues, Gene Service, Tania Pettis, and Jennifer Guy, who wants to once again remind us that you can get your book. How, Jennifer?
Hi, everyone. So yes, in the chat box, and we also have this on our website, and we'll send it out via email to everyone who participated as well. But in the chat box, I've dropped the link as well as a small blurb for how you can purchase inscribed copies of I Am a Man, photographs of the Civil Rights Movement. These you can purchase from Flyleaf Books online and specify your preferred inscription in the order comments during checkout. And you may also call the number that's there in the chat box as well to purchase a copy. One additional thing that I would also like to remind you of is the opportunity to record your stories as part of the UNC Story Archive. I think this is so fitting to speak about this during this conversation. As Professor Ferris mentioned, I think that it is so important for us to all have our history recorded and placed in archives for future generations to come. So please, please click on that link and just take a peek at what the UNC Story Archive is all about. It's a tremendous opportunity to be a part of that project. So thank you all once again for your time on this beautiful Friday. And thank you again to our amazing, incredible presenter for this event. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Jennifer.